Resuming debate, the honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great honour, as always, to stand up in this House to speak on this issue in terms of agriculture, Bill C18, the issue on plant breeders' rights. It's a great honour for me as well because I represent a very large agricultural region in the Temiskaming and Timmins-James Bay region. What we've seen over the last number of years through the boom-bust economy of farming, forestry and mining is that there's been a growing strength in northern agriculture. In the southern part of my riding, there's known as the Little Clay Belt that extends down through Temiskaming, Quebec, and over into northern Ontario. That region now is a $91 million a year direct agriculture business with another $111 million in spin-offs in terms of the support organizations, the dealers, the milk organizations that are in our area. There's over 1,000 people now just in the Temiskaming region alone who are directly implicated by agriculture. So these issues are important to them. I'd like to also point out, Mr. Speaker, that a very interesting transformation in northern agriculture has been happening over the last 25 years in terms of areas that have been opened up to development back at the turn of the last century, and people had homesteaded, but they had found it was very hard and brutal work because of the climate. It was simply not possible to maintain farming over any period of time. So we did have in the so-called upper northern clay belt incredible number of farmlands cleared, but they just couldn't make a go of it. Much of that land was beginning to go back to dogwood and poplar. But we're now seeing a new move back into the agriculture regions in the upper part of Temiskaming and Timmins-James Bay, Valgagne, Black River, Matheson, up towards Cochrane. So a number of factors have made this possible, Mr. Speaker. Certainly changing climate has affected the north, although I would say this past year we did have a very erratic year that was very troubling for farmers. We're seeing with tile drainage in northern fields, when we put tile drainage in, the ability to actually get a crop off the field quicker and in a more sustainable way actually then makes lands that were less profitable before or less possible to run farms now possible. One of the other factors is, of course, we've seen new breeds of plant varieties that work in the north, and so this is certainly a testimony to research and development. We see our ability now in soybeans and grains, canola is a big market in our region for producers, and we also see corn, something that nobody had ever thought possible before, but we have a large growth in corn. Now, at the same time, there's been a whole change in how people perceive agriculture in the north. We did have, back in the day, many small local dairies because you couldn't transport food very long distances. But there's been a move towards bigger and bigger agriculture, and there was a belief that big agriculture was the only way to go, but we've actually seen in the last number of years smaller producers starting to create the niche markets, the organic producers, the people doing specialty foods that people want. And so this is a question, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the balance, and this is what really cuts to the heart of this Bill C18, is that as much as we want to have innovative farming, as much as we want to make sure that we are supporting the research and innovation into the new breeds and new varieties that make it possible to expand agriculture in a world where we need to be able to be building our food supply, we're also having to take into account the fact that consumers are making very clear choices, and they want to be heard in the choices that they're making about the food supply, food security, and the food market. It's not good enough to simply say that big is the only way. We now see in our areas where the local farmers markets, people are wanting to buy local. They want to know where their food is from. They don't want to buy, they're willing to pay more for meats that they know are, do not have the heavy kind of hormone treatments. They want to know what they put on their plates. So this isn't, again, the whole food market, but there's a growing segment of the population. So last year in Timmins, we'd never seen this before. There was a march against Monsanto. concern about very, very large corporate interests and what role they're playing. These are citizens who are saying we want to be part of the decision-making. We want to have choice when we buy. We want to know what's in GMOs. Now, certainly, Mr. Speaker, the GMO issue is a very complex one, and we can't treat the public as though they should be left out of this. This is a right that they have. We see that people are raising their voice about the use of neonicotinoids in terms of pesticides because of the clear damage that's being done to bee populations. So this bill is very important in terms of being able to make sure that that balance is maintained. I think the problem is that we're seeing with Bill C18 is that it's actually yet another omnibus bill. A whole manner of regulatory changes in agriculture were brought in this bill, and some of these are long-standing, some of these are very needed, but in some areas the government just didn't get the mix right. Certainly with the most striking is on the issue of how we implement UPOV 91, and in terms of balancing the rights of the corporate breeders who are creating the new varieties, that they will be certainly protected very well under this regime in terms of the royalties that they get. And certainly, you know, coming from the artistic community, we see that the government spent no effort to ensure that artists ever get paid for their intellectual property, but very large corporate interests are being paid. And it's not a problem with making sure that people are paid for their research and development. This is what drives the economy, and this is what drives development in Canada. It needs to keep its own in the world. But there's also then the question of balance in terms of the small players who want to have the more traditional agriculture. These aren't hobby farms anymore. These are people who have a direct right to be heard. And the issue of long-standing traditions and rights that people have had with plant saving and plant reuse is a big question. We've seen all over the third world the attempt of these corporate interests to go after in India and other jurisdictions against these traditional rights. So we were trying to find a balance. We came forward with 16 amendments, Mr. Speaker, to actually just fine-tune the language. Some of this language is about protecting farmers from needless litigation, and this was an issue that was raised by the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. They wanted to make sure that producers were not going to be sued, as we've seen down in the United States, for claims of patent infringement with respect to natural accidental spreading of patented plant genetic materials. The ability of a corporation to say that if they put genetic materials into seeds that they won't actually then propagate elsewhere, they cannot make that claim. So farmers are worried if they're using the patented genetic seeds that they'd then be charged with infringement if accidentally these seeds then start to move elsewhere. So we had language clarifying this so that we did not have unnecessary litigation against farmers. That was a big issue. One of the other issues that was a real concern that was raised by many people, Mr. Speaker, was the issue of the farmer's privilege and protecting it. We're actually, under this bill, is it taking out of legislation and putting it into the minister's hands the ability to decide himself what levels of protection farmers are able to maintain in terms of these traditional rights. We don't believe that that's accountable. The issue of making sure that there is some level of mechanism of oversight is about fairness. The fact that the minister can simply rewrite the regulations himself and farmers have to live with it, that's not an accountable system, Mr. Speaker. So these are reasonable amendments to move forward, but unfortunately there's a culture within this government that any attempt to improve a bill is seen as a dire threat. So they just turned down 16 amendments. Not that they had to accept all 16, but they couldn't accept one. My colleagues in the Liberal Party brought forward amendments. Government would not accept any. It's a standard practice they have. They believe that accepting amendments, even when they know they're wrong, even when they're bullheadedly wrong, is somehow seen as a form of weakness. Mr. Speaker, I would argue that being unable to work with your colleagues is a sign of an immature political personality. The inability to actually take recommendations that are brought forward in good faith. We saw this with the Copyright Act. We saw the government told us, there will be lots of opportunity for amendments, and they struck down every single amendment. And what we ended up with was a fundamentally flawed bill. It was so flawed, Mr. Speaker, that they actually struck down amendments that would have protected the right of blind people to access materials without being threatened as a criminal, and they would turn that down. That's the level. Now, what happens, Mr. Speaker, when you don't listen to others? You end up with failed legislation, and you end up with recalls. This is the problem. This is why we're raising these issues. They were not respected at committee. They need to be heard. Canadians have a right to be heard about the issues of agriculture and food security. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.